All right, we're back in studio with my friend Noah Blanton, and we're going to talk some more about economic indicators, economic data. And today I want to chat a little bit about how the data is agnostic, as we talked about before, but the data doesn't always take us to the conclusion we think it does. For example, we were chatting offline a bit ago. Let's talk about what happens if we agreed that inflation is not necessarily even close to being under control yet, and that's pretty apparent. The Fed likes to see inflation at around 2%, yes?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yep.
So let's say we start to flirt with a 2% inflation rate. The natural assumption in the mortgage industry is, all right, here we go. Rates are coming down any minute now, and we'll be back in business.
Yeah.
And your comment was, yeah, maybe not.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I would just say, by the way, that would be great. I hope that is true.
Of course.
I hope that's true. That would be lovely.
But we're agreeing that the data is agnostic.
Right. The data is agnostic. So let's have a thought experiment about, maybe a different scenario. Many things that I think held true in the prior cycle may not hold exactly true in this cycle. So, and by the way, the Fed wants a 2% rate of inflation because I think that's a doubling of prices every 32 to 33 years.
Right.
You get above 3%, it's like the Richter scale. It knocks extra years off. We don't want to double prices every, 8 or 9 years. But so they like that 2% for that reason. It's sustainable. We can make that work. But we're in a scenario now where housing is still inflating at, I think, a little under 6% now. It has come down significantly, that's true, but is still inflating at a much higher rate than we would really want. Housing is as much as 26% of the weighted average of the CPI. So it's a really big influencer on the CPI. And I think we have to go back to, we've discussed sort of the knock-on effect of very low fixed-rate mortgages for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of households. So let's say I think it's nearly 90% of all households have a fixed rate below 6%. So the closer you get to 6%, the more there's motivation maybe then for those people to act. But the Fed has, I think, painted themselves a little bit into a corner in terms of where is affordable housing going to come from? How are we going to drive down that part of the CPI? You have this tremendous disincentive. If I have a fixed rate at 3.5%, I am tremendously disincentivized to get rid of that. And by the way, at the rate of inflation today, I still have a negative real world rate on that investment. I think it was Warren Buffett that said a mortgage is the best hedge against the dollar you could ever have. If you have a fixed rate and it goes up, and we're seeing that today. What a wonderful hedge against inflation. If it comes down, you can refinance. So, but I think that there's a scenario in which, let's say, inflation did come down. And I'm accepting your premise for the point of this conversation. I
wouldn't call it a premise. We're just gonna.
It's a thought experiment.
Yeah, we're gonna sandbox this.
Yeah, but then I think we have to talk about some things that are different in this cycle than the last cycle, and some tools at the Fed's disposal not to have housing get overheated and reinflate. So prior to 2009, the Fed did not own mortgage-backed securities.
Right.
The amount in their portfolio was zero. And you can go look up today for yourself, and many of you maybe do, how many they own on a daily and monthly basis.
If you don't follow this and you heard the term quantitative easing, this is what he's referencing. The Fed began a policy of buying mortgage-backed securities in a very aggressive way.
Yeah, in 2008. And I would say, by the way, we're glad they did.
Yeah.
Because had they not, this was the influencer for mortgage interest rates at that period of time as well. It worked at that period of time. It had a long-term effect. A neutral quantitative or a neutral policy would be, I just don't buy or sell any. When one comes in, I replace it with a new one, and we don't increase or decrease the level of assets on their books. Quantitative tightening would be the opposite. We either let them roll off our balance sheet or we actually sell them. So concerned was the MBA, by the way, about the Fed's what they were going to do with mortgage interest rates that together with NAR and the Home Builders Association, they urged the Federal Reserve to clarify whether they would become a net seller of mortgage-backed securities. Okay, why do I say all that? Because there's a scenario in which the Fed could not want mortgage interest rates to come down too much and overheat housing. And so we should think about a scenario where they would stop buying mortgage-backed securities as they are now, accelerate the roll-off, or become a net seller. They have a tremendous ability to influence mortgage interest rates outside of inflation. They're the largest consumer of mortgages. I think they own 25 or 27% of the entire mortgage market. And should they decide to become a net seller of those, it will drive rates up even as inflation comes down. So I think we need to consider and think about a scenario where that may be possible and not consider anymore that it's a one-to-one. As inflation comes down and 10-year treasuries come down, we will see mortgage interest rates come down. And I want to say one other thing about that, because we have seen the longest period of time of the disassociation, the large disassociation between a 10-year treasury and a 30-year mortgage, the longest disassociation we've seen in 50 years. There's a reason for that.
You know, it's funny you say all this, because the last time we chatted, you talk about how the previous market had long-term effect and affects this in the present market. And that's a great illustration of exactly what you're talking about. The Fed's decision to buy mortgage-backed securities in such an aggressive way has left them as the single biggest holder of mortgage-backed securities, and with the ability to, or perhaps at some point in the future, the necessity to overtly influence the market by choosing to sell off a small or large portion of those.
The Fed is the market maker now.
There you go.
I mean, that's
for the first time in history.
For the first time in history. And maybe we didn't see that up until this point. The current cycle that we just went through, ultra low rates followed by ultra high rates, the disassociation of the 30-year mortgage rate and the 10-year treasury outside of their historical long-term relationship. There's a reason for that. We should pay attention to it.
And this is part of why I think this is so important. I'm so grateful to have you here, because when we were going through the heat of quantitative easing, we were all thrilled that mortgage rates were hitting lows that they'd never seen before. It made home ownership more affordable, especially for first-time home buyers. It produced some really wonderful things.
No question.
And that's great. But it lasted too long. It created a false economy. And then it made the Fed the single biggest holder of mortgage-backed securities, and now with an undue influence on the market that they've never had before. And there's reasons that they never had it before.
Yeah. And we should just, back to the agnostic nature of data, just be very clear-eyed, look at those things and wonder about what that means for our current market. We should have some curiosity about that.
That's the most important, or maybe the most salient point, is we have to be curious about the data, and we have to look at the data in historical context. And when we do that, we start to get indicators, which had we done that in 2007, we would have had indicators, or we did have indicators, just nobody wanted to pay attention to them.
Michael Berry did.
Michael Berry did, who got shouted down quite a bit at that time. Well, listen, like I said in the last episode, we can continue these conversations for a long time, and that's why we're breaking them into more consumable bites like we are right now. But I would like to say this about my friend and my highly esteemed professional associate, Noah. If you're looking for somebody to come talk to your group about economics as it pertains to housing and real estate, man, I can't recommend Noah highly enough. He has a broad and deep perspective on this information, on this knowledge, because he's just a walk for it. He reads this stuff all the time. He eats, sleeps, and drinks it. So, and one of the great things I love about you, Noah, is you have a knack for taking this information and boiling it down into more consumable and understandable chunks.
I appreciate that. And I like to talk. So
you do like
that
to
helps.
talk. You do like to talk about this and all kinds of other topics. Well, listen, thank you for joining us. We will be back, I hope, again with Noah Blanton in studio. Until then, check us out at knowledgecoop.com.